This is a video entitled What I Wish Muslims Would Get About the Trinity. We first need to go over a little story about three people, Alicia, Benny, and Conan.
Crush your enemies.
Alicia and Benny are in love. They've been together for a while now. But something is about to go awry, and it will go awry in the way of blood and murder.
Okay, sweetie, I'm gonna go use the restroom.
Hey there, baby girl. I don't usually do this, but I saw you from across the way.
Oh?
And I gotta tell you something. Yo, honey. Amazing.
How dare he? I'm a murder Conan. He's hitting on my girl.
I'm so excited about going fishing. Benny, curse your sudden but inevitable betrayal.
Take that. Keep my girlfriend's name out of your mother mouth.
Murray.
Alright, so that video we just saw is pretty helpful for understanding the Trinity, believe it or not. So you can separate it out into separate things. You have the evidence, which is the blood on the ground, the dead body, the knife, the witnesses, what they're going to testify to, the outgoing text message that shows motive. All that's your evidence, and you can think of that as an analogy for the scripture that's the evidence for the Trinity. So the evidence isn't the crime, the evidence isn't our theories about the crime, the evidence is just the evidence. The next thing to point out that's a separate thing is the crime itself, the actual killing of Conan by Benny. This you could think of, if we're comparing it to the Trinity, like who God actually is. Is he actually a Trinity? Whatever it is that he actually is, that's sort of like the actual crime. The third thing to differentiate from the other things is our theories about what happened. You can have theories about who killed who and why, and the theories might be wrong, but that doesn't change the evidence, and it doesn't change what actually happened.
But what if Emma is right? What if someone else wrote those texts, and this is all just an elaborate frame-up, and Emma's just a patsy?
And if it takes a while for you to figure out who killed who and why, that doesn't mean that your theory is wrong. You don't have to know immediately who the killer is in order to have a correct theory about who killed who.
And matched his DNA to Galvin's clothes, closing the case after 52 years.
It's the same with the Trinity. Just because it takes time to figure out doesn't mean that the theory is wrong.
How comes you have 300 years?
So that's the first thing that I want Muslims to understand, is just because there isn't a totally explicit, spelled out Trinity from the beginning, that basically has no relevance as to whether the Trinity is true or not. Just like if it takes you a long time to figure out who committed a crime, that has no relevance as to whether the theory is true or not.
How'd you find me anyway?
I'm a detective. That's what I do.
My mother told you, didn't she?
Full understanding is not necessary in either case. Well, what do I mean by full understanding? We can know that Benny killed Conan without knowing every single motivation that he had. We don't need to be an expert on the anatomy of the human body and how much pressure it can take from a knife. We don't need to know how many atoms there are in the knife. We don't need to know about the wave function collapsing because it's being observed, like quantum mechanics. We don't need to know every single detail of how this worked out in order to have a valid theory and valid evidence pointing to a valid theory that Benny killed Conan. In the same way, with the Trinity, you don't need to understand every single aspect and detail of the Trinity in order to validly believe that the Trinity is the way that God actually exists. It's the same with, for example, when my daughter is hungry, I tell her to go eat a hot dog. I don't need to know everything about cells and energy and ATP and how it's broken down by the body and the biochemistry of her digestive system and how that relates to consciousness and the subjective state of feeling hungry or not hungry. I can know that eating a hot dog will get rid of hunger without knowing every detail, just as I can know that God is one being in three persons without knowing every detail. Each specific piece of evidence with our case with Conan and Benny by itself won't point to a murder. So if you just have a bloody knife on the ground, that doesn't mean that Benny killed Conan. It's not enough evidence. If you had just the witnesses saying they saw it, but Conan is still alive, right, and there isn't a knife on the ground, then you know that the witnesses probably just saw something wrong. If you have just the text message, I'm going to murder Conan, but he never murders him, there's no witnesses, there's no knife, that won't work on its own. Just the dead body of Conan alone isn't enough to convict Benny. But when you start putting all of that evidence together, once the evidence is cumulative, then you can make a proper theory and correctly believe that Benny killed Conan. In the same way with the Trinity, if you pick out just random specific verses, you don't have a whole verse that spells out the Trinity, that God is one being in three persons. However, if you start getting like Colossians 1, Hebrews 1, John 1, and you start collecting all of these verses together and looking at all of them in detail, and then looking at that evidence and then coming up with a theory that holds all of the evidence, that's how you end up getting to the Trinity.
The concept of Trinity, the word Trinity, doesn't exist anywhere in the Bible.
The fact that you can't just get one verse on its own and get to the Trinity is irrelevant. Just like seeing that the bloody knife on the ground alone won't prove a murder is irrelevant. All of the evidence works together and speaks with each other in order to make the most parsimonious, least ad hoc explanation of the data. Fourth, there's no logical contradiction in having something be one and multiple things at the same time.
Explain to us how the Father, Son, and Spirit are all one God, but they're not identical with each other, and explain it in a way that the average layperson can understand it.
He doesn't understand. Explain as you would a child.
For example, this is one book, but it has multiple pages. Okay, something can be one and many at the same time as long as you're talking about different units. So here we have one book, and then there's pages. There's multiple pages. In the same way, as long as a being and a person are not the same thing, you can have one being be multiple persons without there being a logical contradiction. You can get into more detail about this looking at debates between Muslims and Christians who are more intelligent than I am.
The necessary conditions that would provide justification for our knowledge must be both metaphysically.
What metalogical issues are, that's what the transcendental argument is. You ought to be aware of metaphysical issues.
I'm too dumb to understand any of that, and if you're being honest with yourself, you probably don't understand it either.
I ain't got a good brain.
And that's okay. You don't, like my prior point, you don't have to know everything about the Trinity in order to understand it enough to believe it. Not all data has to perfectly conform to a theory for the theory to still be good. So for example, let's say that the knife has Benny's fingerprints on it, but it also has the fingerprints of another guy named Daniel.
Hello there.
Just because Daniel's fingerprints are on the knife, that doesn't prove that Benny didn't do the killing. So let's suppose that Daniel's fingerprints are on the knife and Benny's are, and the witnesses saw him. He sent out the text message, the dead body, people saw him there. That just because there's evidence out there that doesn't really support the theory that Benny killed Conan, that doesn't disprove that Benny killed Conan. So in the same way, if you cherry pick some verse that supposedly debunks the Trinity, that doesn't actually debunk the Trinity. So one of the really common ones is someone going up to Jesus and saying, "Good teacher," and Jesus responds, "Only God is good." But if you keep reading, the man who he's talking to asks him, what do I need to do to be good? And Jesus says, follow all the commandments, and on and on. And then he says, I've already done these things. And then Jesus says, then sell everything you have, give to the poor, and follow me. If you want to be morally perfect, follow me. All right, so Jesus has made a very easy puzzle here. You can almost imagine him winking at the camera because he says only God is good. Oh, and if you want to be good, follow me. And there's this myth that in the earliest Gospels, Jesus isn't portrayed as God.
Jesus Christ saying that he's God himself doesn't appear to be really in the Bible. And if you are going to say the Gospel of John has some of those references, well, the Gospel of John is a very late reference itself.
But you can see even atheists question this.
And the very earliest Gospel preached the divinity of Jesus. Like Jesus is God.
I used to believe this when I was an atheist, but whenever I became a Christian again, I learned Greek, like looking at Mark 6.
The very earliest Gospel.
Like there's no mistaking what's going on here. So it says that he looked out the crowds and he felt empathy for them like a shepherd. This is a reference to Ezekiel 34. In Ezekiel 34, God says he's going to be the shepherd for Israel, and he says that that David is going to be the shepherd for Israel. So both God and David are supposed to be this shepherd for Israel, this good shepherd, and the two characters are blended together in that passage. Like, who's supposed to be the good shepherd? Is it God or David? It's both. And then if you look at Isaiah 53, the whole thing is explicitly about Jesus. Who has believed our message, to whom has the arm of the Lord been revealed? That arm of the Lord means like an aspect of God. And then it goes on, he grew up before him like a tender shoot, like a root out of dry ground. Now, some people say that it's talking about the people of Israel here, but that doesn't make any sense. The people of Israel never died for the sins of the people of Israel. They weren't sinless. They didn't go silently to their deaths. This is talking about Jesus. And you can tell because the word root here is the same one that's used talking about the root of Jesse, who's the future Messiah. This is how it's used in Isaiah 11. So if you look at Ezekiel 34 and Isaiah 53, that should come as no surprise then to us in Mark 6 when he's walking on water, which is something only Yahweh can do, according to Job 9. And then it says he's about to pass them by, which is something that Yahweh does in an anthropomorphic form in 1 Kings 19 and Exodus 32. Whenever he appears before Moses and passes by, whenever he appears before Elijah and passes by. So here, Jesus is out on the water, he's walking on water, he's about to pass them by, and they don't ask who is that. All they're doing is being scared. So in response to no question, he just says, I am, which is the divine name. He says ego eimi in the Greek. So he's walking on water, which only God does. He's passing by like God does. And he calls himself the divine name and says, I am, like God. And then if you keep reading in the chapter, it says they were confused for they did not understand about the loaves. So what's the modus tollens there? If they had understood about the loaves, they would not have been confused. Well, what are the loaves telling us? The loaves are telling us that Jesus is the character, the good shepherd from Ezekiel 34, where Yahweh and David are blended into the same character. My next point is that if God created space-time, then if he's ever going to interact with people within space-time, he's going to have to make a separate person of himself that's the same being. Because God's consciousness doesn't operate within time. But if there's a character speaking to a character in the Quran, say, or in the Bible, and they're operating within space-time, that means that can't be the entirety of God. So, for example, in Surah 20, Ayah 10, we read that God spoke to Moses from a fire. Quote, when he saw a fire and said to his people, indeed, wait, I see a fire far off. Perhaps I may bring you a brand from it, or may find guidance at the fire. And when he reached it, he was called by name. O Moses, indeed, it is I, your Lord. This is Yahweh speaking to Moses in space-time. Okay, so if this fire is Allah, does that mean that Allah is a campfire? Right, so a lot of times you'll see Muslims saying, Jesus is God, God isn't born, Jesus is born, how can Jesus be born? And they go through and they find these little aspects like this. But anytime that God operates within space-time, you can play the same game, right? So is this really God? Because God, he's not located in any specific area, but here's a fire that's speaking to Moses in the Quran. So is Allah just a campfire? Does he give off heat? Does he only exist at this time and place? How is he sending out sound waves in time and space to Moses if he exists outside of time and space? And so the reason the Trinity makes sense is because if there is a necessary being that exists outside of space-time, then he would have to somehow create a version of himself within that program in order to talk to people within it. So the same way, imagine a computer programmer who makes a video game and then wants to talk to characters within the video game. Like, I can't just jump into a computer. I would have to make an avatar of myself.
Once you're seated behind your computers, a photograph of you will be taken, and an avatar will be made from your likeness.
I didn't bring my likeness.
It's the same way with a necessarily existent, all-powerful, divine being that exists outside of time and space. If they wanted to interact with us at all, they're going to have to somehow make a version of themselves that's limited to space and time so they can communicate with other beings that are limited in space and time.
I have information on the following topics.
Holy crap, where have you been my whole life?
Allah does other things like this multiple times in the Quran. He mounts a throne. And so we could play that same game. Does Allah have a butt? Does he sit down? Does he have a body? How does a God who created space and time have a butt? So this is a separate person but the same being of Allah. This is the anthropomorphic Allah, right? So you see that this is just like in Christianity where Jesus is sort of like an avatar of God. This Allah character who's sitting in a throne and appearing as a campfire is an avatar of Allah. And there's all this language in the Quran about associating partners with God. Christianity doesn't do that. Jesus is God. He's not a partner. You can say he's a separate person, but he really is just God incarnate. If you read Hebrews, he's the apagasma tes doxes, the eminence of the glory of God. In Colossians 1, he's the eikon tu auratu. So he's the image of the unseen God. That word eikon is where we get the word icon, like a computer icon. He's also the character, karakter, and that's the exact representation. The Greek word was used for like an imprint of something, of his hypostaseos, of his being. So he's the exact representation of his being. He is the eminence of his glory, and he is the image of the invisible God. This is biblical language. If you go to John 1:1, John is considered to be the Injil, which according to Surah 547, you're supposed to judge by if you're a Muslim. The Injil, in Surat Rasul Allah, the earliest most complete biography of Muhammad, Ibn Ishaq calls the Gospel of John part of the Injil. So in that Gospel, that's called the Injil, that's supported by the Quran, in the very first verse, it says, En archein hologos kai hologos en proston theon. That's in the beginning was the Word. The Word is talking about Jesus. That's the same within the Quran. And the Word was with God, and the Word was God. So it's there in the Injil, buddy. It's there in the Injil, and it's logically necessary if an infinite God is going to speak to us that he would have to locate himself within time and space. He would have to become one of us in order to interact with us.
Get out of here. Stop it. Stop it.